If you're old enough to remember 1991, and if you're in my audience, I know you are, then you may recall when former Baltimore Orioles left-hander, celebrated semi-nude model, and erstwhile television commentator Jim Palmer announced that he was making a comeback to the mound at the venerable old age of 45. And the Orioles front office, they must have either seen something they liked when they worked him out, or they were mentally debilitated by the combined effects of obligation and pity. But whichever it was, they extended him an invitation to their major league camp in 1991. And just as a quick aside, there's a fun anecdote that came out of that whole thing that I want to briefly relate. Palmer wants to get sharp before spring training starts, so he goes to Miami University, and he's throwing on one of their baseball fields. The Miami team, they're practicing on an adjacent field, and one of their pitching coaches keeps looking over at this weird old lefty who's throwing on this other field. Why does that guy have such a weird motion? Is he from the freaking 60s or something? Eventually, curiosity gets the best of him, and he walks over to Palmer, having no idea who he is, and he says, "Hey, pal, I don't know who you are, but you are never getting to the Hall of Fame with mechanics like that." And Palmer says, right on cue, "Well, I guess it's a good thing I'm already in the Hall of Fame." But Palmer's comeback was a pretty big story for 3 or 4 weeks, as I recall. This was right when George Foreman's comeback was starting to gain a lot of attention. He had got himself all the way back into the heavyweight title picture, so middle-aged athletes coming back to make good against the youngsters was very fashionable at the moment, and most people treated Palmer's comeback like it was a perfectly serious thing. And they might have really believed that. Hell, he might have really believed it too. But in the actual event, he made one start in one spring training game, served up a heaping helping of 81-mile-per-hour fastballs that got batted around the ball yard with extreme prejudice, and promptly re-retired after giving up 5 earned runs on 8 hits in 2 innings. And believe you me, when you go back and look at that tape, the real upset is that he managed to get 6 men out. Now, why do I bring up this story about a man going back to the well many years later, trying to recapture his professional glory days and failing miserably at it? A man operating in a world of self-delusion where he thinks he can go right back to the job he had 20 years ago and deliver the same results he used to deliver back when he was a much younger and more talented man? Well, have you seen Jon Stewart's triumphant return to The Daily Show? No, you probably haven't. Few people have. And if your first reaction was to say, wait, The Daily Show is still a thing? Didn't that show end shortly after they replaced Stewart with that desperately unfunny left-wing knob polisher from South Africa? Well, you're probably not the only one who thought that. The point being, I watched a little sampling of it, so you don't have to. You're welcome. And it's pretty rough. Like, even rougher than you might expect, which is saying a lot. Because let's face it, The Daily Show used to be funny, but you can't make that show anymore. People of all sorts of political proclivities used to watch The Daily Show because it was a show that mocked and satirized the entire political ecosystem and everybody in it. But you can't do a funny show if it's just an exercise in tired, establishment-approved partisan bomb-throwing, and that is all Stewart knows how to do now. And I've got no punction about saying it. Full disclosure, Lady Curmudgeon and I, back in the day, we used to watch The Daily Show more nights than we didn't. And we're going way back here, back when Stephen Colbert was still Steve Colbert, and Steve Carell and Rob Corddry were the other main correspondents. That show was funny as hell. And what made it funny was that those 3 guys, the correspondents, they could act convincingly close enough to real news reporters that they could get politicians and government officials to give on-camera interviews not knowing they were on a comedy show and that they're the butt of the joke. But there's a more troubling question we need to ask about Jon Stewart himself. Was he ever actually all that talented, or was he just a guy who knew how to read a prompter who was lucky enough to be surrounded with good writers and great supporting players? Because when I search my mental archive thinking of the funniest things I ever saw on The Daily Show, I don't think Stewart had a part in any of them. Have you ever listened to Jon Stewart speaking in an extemporaneous setting and thought, wow, Jon Stewart just said a really insightful thing? Me either. Have you ever heard Jon Stewart left to his own devices without a prepared text? Make a funny joke? Me either. So it would seem that now, for the first time ever, Stewart has his own TV show that he has to carry primarily on the strength of his own badly fated talents. And it's going just about as well as it went for Jim Palmer. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where Lady Curmudgeon says I haven't lost anything off my fastball either, but I don't know if she's just being nice. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And if I came up and asked you, all right, in terms of casualties per capita, what was the second bloodiest battle for the Union Army in the whole Civil War? Would you have said, that's easy, it's the Battle of Olustee? No, of course you wouldn't have said that. And that's why it's interesting. And if your next question is, what the hell is the Battle of Olustee? Well, I'm glad you asked. For starters, it took place exactly 160 years ago on 20 February 1864. It's also the biggest battle fought in the Florida theater, to the extent that there even was a Florida theater, which there really wasn't. And we should probably start, before we proceed to the nuts and bolts of the battle, by taking a minute to set the scene in Florida during the Civil War, or the War of Dastardly Yankee Aggression for our rebel viewers. Now, Florida was kind of a weird place in 1861, and it mostly just got weirder as the war went on. Bear in mind, Florida's only been American since 1821. It's only been a state since 1845. And when the Spaniards bugged out and left, they left behind a not insignificant number of Spanish-speaking Floridians. It's not until the early 40s that an equilibrium is reached between the Anglophone and the Hispanophone populations, at least in terms of persons not held in a condition of involuntary servitude, because that's the other demographic quirk of Florida at the start of the Civil War. As a proportion of the whole, they have got a bigger slave population than any state ever had. It's basically 50%, and the other 50% is more or less evenly split between the Spanish-speaking descendants of the former colonial power and the settlers from various parts of America who have arrived since the acquisition of the territory 20 years previously. So when the 1860 presidential election comes and goes, and it's time for all the southern states to make the call on whether they want to secede from the Union, it's by no means a settled question down in Florida. The secession does wind up happening, obviously, but all of the U.S. Navy's installations in Florida remain in U.S. hands throughout the war, as does the city of Jacksonville, which is quite helpful when you've got a naval blockade that you need to establish. And there are pockets of Florida all over the place that become known as pro-Union enclaves, especially in the coastal regions. And so the Confederate Army never really tries to take them or hold them. The approach of the Confederate General Staff is to say, we'll ride off the entire coast and we'll just defend the interior of the peninsula if it ever happens to come to that. Because while it mostly wasn't an active combat theater, Florida had a position of huge importance to the Confederacy in terms of agricultural production, and that importance gets magnified all the more after the fall of Vicksburg. So no supplies from the Western Confederacy can get into the Eastern Confederacy anymore, so Florida becomes the bread basket and the beef basket for all the states in the southwest of the Confederacy where the heaviest fighting is going on. And you know who else realizes how important Florida is to the continuing ability of the rebels to engage in armed resistance? The fucking Union, that's who. And since we hold the city of Jacksonville, let's say we stick a brigade down there. We'll have them reconnoiter the area, gauge the enemy defenses, and maybe if the reports are favorable, we'll follow up with a division-sized force and make an attempt to cut off the whole peninsula and starve these secessionist rascals right into submission. And who did they send to lead the operation? Brigadier General Truman Seymour, and if that's not the perfect Civil War name, I don't know what the hell is. Burlington, Vermont, West Point class of 1846, classmate of George Pickett, George McClellan, and Thomas J. Jackson, Stonewall to his friends. And this guy has got possibly the most badass claim to fame in the entire Civil War, for my money. Because how many guys do you know who were present at the Battle of Fort Sumter and also present at the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse? And a pretty nice career trajectory, too, since he was an artillery captain at the former and a goddamn major general at the latter. Now, General Seymour has pretty clear written orders when he arrives in Jacksonville. You're not to engage in any large-scale offensive operations. You're not trying to capture and hold territory. Just send out some pickets, probe the enemy defenses, maybe do a little raid here and there if you're feeling frisky. Mostly, we just want you to find out if there are any regular Confederate forces in the area or if it's just local irregular militia types that we're up against. So get us some intelligence, make your report, and then hold tight and await further instructions. And Seymour did as he was told, up to a point. But he had such great success with the pickets and the raiding parties he sent out because they only came up against local militia and swept them aside without much trouble that he starts thinking, you know what? I bet there is nothing between us and the Florida state capitol except these little local irregular militia types. I bet I could march my 5,000 men all the way to freaking Tallahassee without stubbing a toe. And by God, I think I'm going to do it. But you know who was standing there watching in Charleston, South Carolina as the flotilla went by carrying Seymour and his men and put two and two together and surmised that he might be landing in Jacksonville and attempting an incursion into the Florida interior? The fucking rebels, that's who. And the local Confederate commander for the Florida theater, such as it is, Joseph Finnegan out of County Monaghan, Ireland. Emigrated to Florida as a teenager, built himself a sawmill, turned that into a law of practice. By the time the war breaks out, he's one of the wealthiest sons of bitches in the whole state, just finished building himself a 40-room mansion. But like a lot of wealthy men on both sides, and try to picture this happening today, when the trumpets sounded, he didn't think twice about putting on the uniform and rendering military service. To the extent that being the commander of Florida counts as rendering military service, but hey, how many opportunities are there in life where you can walk in without a day of military experience and be declared a brigadier general just because you're rich? You can't pass those up. That's all I'm saying. At first, he's commanding just his own corner of Florida, but the other guys wind up being so worthless that by the start of 1864, he is in charge of the whole state, and he doesn't have many regular forces at his disposal, mostly just local irregular militia that Seymour's men have been slicing through with such alacrity. He spends most of his time, if we're being honest, trying to police the weird outlaw communities that have developed in the Florida wilderness and swamps during the war. You had some Confederate defectors, some pro-Unionists who'd gone into hiding, some runaway slaves, and they would get together with each other and harass any Confederate forces they happened to see. So it was like a fun little mini Vietnam where Disney World is today, basically. So Finnegan's just minding his own business when all of a sudden he gets a message from General Beauregard up in Charleston. And I'm sorry, I can't mention that man without saying his full name. Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard. It's a weakness, what can I say? And Beauregard says, dude, we just saw a whole shitload of Yankee troop ships float past and we're thinking they might land at Jacksonville with the intent of engaging you in battle. And Finnegan says, yeah, no shit, Sherlock. He's been slicing through my guys like butter for nearly a week now. Where the hell have you been? Are you sending me some real troops so I can engage this son of a bitch or what? And Beauregard says, you bet your sweet ass I am. I have got General Alfred H. Colquitt, the future governor of Georgia, already headed your way with 4,000 men. So gather together whatever remains of that worthless rabble you command and go link up with Colquitt, and maybe we'll have equal numbers to the Yankee aggressors. Which they didn't, quite. In the event, but it wound up not mattering much. It was the Yankee aggressors with a 500-man advantage in the actual event. Though by the end of the day, they were the ones fleeing the field in disarray. We can't call it a rout. It was pretty close to a rout, but they did manage to get it together and turn it into an orderly retreat and then a fighting organized rearguard action. And the unit that made that all happen, the 54th Massachusetts, the guys from the Glory movie, which if you haven't seen it, you're banned from the channel. This was their next action after the Battle of Fort Wagner, the battle in which Matthew Broderick and Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman and every other actor with their name in the opening credits got killed. But we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. And remember, Seymour doesn't know about any of this. He thinks he's on a fun field trip to go conquer Tallahassee, and he might have to dispatch some local militia here and there, but he's got no idea that he's about to come up against an equal strength force of Georgian regulars, which he does at about 2:30 in the afternoon on 20 February. And how bad was Seymour's misjudgment here? Well, not only was he unaware of the possibility of having to fight a pitched battle against anybody today, but the Georgians have made the march southward so quickly that by the time Seymour arrives in the vicinity of Olustee Station, the rebels have already had time to link up their forces and choose the battleground and prepare defensive emplacements, trenches and everything, the whole shooting match. So, has Seymour fucked himself right from the outset? Has his good judgment been clouded by arrogance and hubris like many a commander before him, to the point where he just blundered himself and his men into a human slaughterhouse of his own creation? Yes, he has done all of that, but it gets worse. The battle has already been joined, and his guys are already well and truly losing before Seymour pulls his head far enough out of his ass to make the realization that, you know what, I don't think these guys are local militia. I think this might be regular army we're fighting. So crucially, fatally, he hesitates to commit as much of his force into the initial maelstrom as he ought to have done, since he's gotten so spoiled on watching his guys thrash these local militia types. He thinks that's just the way things are. That's the normal state of the universe. But yeah, it ain't. The Union side, they took 34% casualties that day, and it speaks to how indescribably horrific that war was, that even on a day when they beat the enemy so bad he fled the field in disarray, the winning side took 19% casualties. The only worst casualty rate in a battle for the Union side comes a couple of months after this battle, at the Battle of the Crater, which that one probably also warrants its own video on the 160th anniversary when it comes up, I think. But here's the Cliff's Notes version of that one to tide you over until then. That was the time when the Union said, dynamite is awesome, let's do something with it. And it was decided, all right, we'll build a trench under the Confederate lines at Petersburg. This siege warfare, it's so goddamn boring. We got to speed things up. We'll put a whole shitload of dynamite down the trench. We'll blow it up, and then that'll be awesome. And that was just about the extent of the tactical plan. In the event, they blew up the dynamite and it made a loud noise and a big hole, and then several thousand Union guys decided it would be fun to march into the hole and mill around at the bottom. Where were the division commanders, you might ask? In a tent getting drunk. Who was the guy in actual operational command? Ambrose E. Burnside. Probably the single most useless general in the history of the U.S. Army. And yeah, he's the guy with the sideburns. The Union casualty rate that day, a cool 44%, a full 10% worse than Seymour's fiasco at Olustee. Because it didn't take the rebels all that long to regroup and say, gosh, if all those Yankees are going to go into the bottom of that big hole, we might as well kill them, mightn't we? If there's an American Civil War equivalent of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, here it is. This was it. So yeah, I think that battle definitely getting a video. Stay tuned in July. Thanks very much indeed for watching. Stay tuned later in the week for a brand new parody song with viewer-contributed lyrics. Pretty excited about that. It's cool when somebody else does all the work and you just have to be the song and dance man. And I will be taking suggestions down in the comments for what sort of wardrobe I should wear for doing a Johnny Paycheck number. Have a great day and a pleasant tomorrow. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.